Now, welcome back to our session, Trends and New Forms of Exile Journalism. We're living in challenging times right now due to the corona pandemic, also regarding our working conditions that all of a sudden changed. Home office meant getting used to video conference tools, the ones that we're using right now, and everyone needed to learn how to log into the remote desktop of your company's IT network. And honestly, after a few weeks in home office, one felt quite isolated, isn't it? These are experiences that are not new for journalists living in exile. They're forced to become experts when it comes to find new ways and forms of doing research, publishing, and reporting, mostly working on their own, often without the support of a big media company, and sometimes still being jeopardized. How do you manage that? And what are the current trends that enable journalists in exile to continue working, but also stay safe? That's what we would like to discuss right now with our guests that I would like to welcome right now. Hello, everyone. So welcome Meera Selva. She is the director of the Journalist Fellowship Program at the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. Before, she has worked for many years and also from many countries as a correspondent and editor for a top media branch such as Daily Telegraph, AP, or the German newspaper Handelsblatt. Welcome, Meera.
Thank you. Welcome. Lovely to be here.
With us is also Dr. Walid Al-Saqaf. He has always tried to combine his passion for technology and journalism in his home country, the Yemen, which is one of the most dangerous countries for journalists in the world. And that is also why he went to exile in Sweden. He became a real crack in media technology there, and right now, he works at Södertörn University in Stockholm as a senior lecturer, and he's always trying to find new ways how technology can enable free journalism and how to avoid censorship. So please say hello to welcome Dr. Al-Saqaf.
Thank you.
How challenging it is how to start over in a totally new environment has also experienced our third guest, Abdulwahab Tahhan. He is a journalist originally from Aleppo, Syria, and he went to exile in London. But actually now, Abdulwahab, you live in Hong Kong, working as a lecturer for English at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Making a life in exile is also the topic of a successful podcast you've started, and that's what we're talking about right now. So hello, Abdulwahab Tahhan.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, since we're living in such unusual time, I would like to ask you one question off topic. Abdulwahab, in what ways does the corona pandemic at the moment affect the work of journalists in Syria? Do you still have contact with them?
Well, I still have contacts with a lot of people inside Syria, friends and family mostly, and a lot of journalists are affected. But in Syria, it's the usual situation. It is the lack of security that's the most important issue, which in both areas. In Assad control area, you don't have any freedom of press. In some other areas, rebel control area, not all of it, some of it that's controlled by some terrorist organization, as in ISIS, we saw in Raqqa, where people didn't really have any choices or any freedom of press. And in some places, such as in Idlib now, where there are some terrorist organizations, such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, where they execute people. Currently, there is a female journalist who is under arrest, and there are fears that she's going to be executed. Well, the corona has not really played a huge role in that because the situation is still the same, pretty much, because of the lack of testing. When you don't test, you don't really know whether there's a corona cases or not. It's just like a flu. But the dire situation is that the war itself has, catastrophic circumstances and consequences on people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Walid, what about the situation in Yemen? How about reporting about corona issues there?
Thank you. Well, having Syria and Yemen to start with is really depressing. But let me add on to say that in Yemen, the situation is more about the malnutrition and lack of basic needs of the population. So the very basic needs of nutrition, for example, making ends meet at the end of the day have become a priority. So many of them have had to work in crowded conditions despite the pandemic. And so they either can starve to death at home, be in lockdown, or venture and try and hope and pray for not catching the virus and not dying because of that. Because even if you do have the fact that we still have very, very simple medical and health services, they are absolutely not equipped to handle a pandemic of this size. They can't even handle many of the regular diseases that are like, the cholera outbreak that happened. I mean, and many of these diseases still are rampant. So we sometimes try to take it lightly and joke about it and saying that, if it were to decide to come to Yemen, it would actually not, because it's already crowded with other diseases. So the outbreak of the pandemic has been one added misery to the population. And this absolutely affects journalists, not only in terms of being themselves potential victims of it, but because they can't do a lot in terms of coverage, since it's seen as a sensitive topic by the rebels in the north, as well as the authorities ruling parts of the south, because they see this as weakness of the authorities in not controlling the pandemic. So they are having it both ways, unfortunately, in a direly negative situation.
So dramatic situation, even worsening. Meera, you're in contact with a lot of students, fellows who are right there at Oxford, but also with former fellows who live in other countries. What do you hear from them?
What I hear is that the coronavirus is deepening existing structural inequalities and highlighting all the kind of all the weaknesses you see in society. So certainly migrant workers, people in refugee camps, people who are not citizens of the countries they're living in are really caught in this net where they don't necessarily have access to treatment, they don't have access to the services, they're scared in many cases about the health challenges they face. And in terms of journalism, what we're seeing is that it's impossible it's getting even harder to report from the ground, because the thing with the coronavirus is that the front lines have moved. They moved to inside hospitals, to inside care homes. These are places that are hard to access anyway, but at this moment in time, it's virtually impossible to get access. So it's hard to get a sense of what's really going on in a lot of countries.
Well, thank you very much for these brief insights. Now we're coming back to our actual topic, and I would like to know from you, Walid, you've always tried to find out how digitalization could enhance the situation for journalists and also could better independent press. If you had to start over in exile nowadays with access to technology you have right now, what tools would you use for reporting or for doing journalistic work?
Excellent question. So there are two elements of this. The first element is the technology, the tools. And that is one thing that we need to be aware of, that technologies evolve over time. And we've seen this, of course, with the outbursts of connectivity online in many countries in the region and around the world. And so one opportunity is to use these tools, meaning that you have the bandwidth, you have the equipment, and you have, let's say, the fundamental services such as the social media services that you have to disseminate your messages, etc. But the other aspect that needs to be addressed also is the resources, the human resources, the capacity, the competence, the ability to understand what is dangerous, what is not, what is important, what is not, how to differentiate between disinformation and accurate and factual information. So these come in hand. And in many countries, unfortunately, we have while one might be good, the other is weak, or vice versa, or sometimes both are weak in some countries like Yemen, for example. So I've been seeing opportunities in this, but sometimes if you have the opportunity without equipping it with the skills, and the opportunity in terms of equipment and hardware and software, without the proper skills and resources, that can actually backfire, because it can lead to viral disinformation campaigns being used by the parties that are in conflict, for example. And that's much more severe in situations of war, where these technologies can be abused by, so to speak, the fighting parties, but also elements that enable them, including sometimes, unfortunately, some journalists, either willingly or without properly understanding the contribution that they have on the conflict. So I would say that, yes, there are opportunities, and I've been looking into this for a while. My history goes back into the Arab Arab Spring, when journalists used the internet to explore and show that there is information. But over time, I've come to realize that, yes, the technology can be enabling, but it's much, much more important nowadays, especially to equip the journalists with the methods and skills and trainings. And that's why we've been working, even though here in Sweden, we do have some software and tools that allow journalists to work on disinformation tracking and, let's say, confronting, but also these technologies are global in nature, so they can be transferred to other parts of the world. That's another opportunity that we need to explore.
So it does have a positive side and a negative side, as you said, if it's also used by the regimes in order to do surveillance, in order to spread fake news, and also to do censorship. Actually, you once were a victim of censorship, and you invented something that allowed it to avoid it. Can you tell us something about it? It's already a few years ago, but I think it's still very interesting to hear something about it.
Yes, of course. I mean, when we started in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, you may recall that there was so much repression online. I mean, you couldn't access many of the oppositional websites, sometimes even social media websites. So I created a tool that was called ElCasa at the time. It's a long time now, since been almost 10 years since I started with the project. But the idea behind it was to enable journalists to access censored content and disseminate content, and sometimes use the tool to create, let's say, lines of communication. It was used in Syria for a time, using, for example, the tool to access Skype for communication, which was at certain times blocked. But it was useful for a particular period of time when the authorities didn't really take advantage of surveillance techniques that later developed and evolved. So I would say, yes, that tool was very useful for a particular period of time. But over time, unfortunately, authorities find new ways of repression that might actually use the very same tools that we have created to lure activists and lure journalists to using them and then spying on them and then now creating more targeted attacks. And so that's why whenever we create a tool, we need to constantly have a dynamic approach to it, knowing what is it that it can, new challenges that it can introduce, and how to look into ways to fix them. So that's why I moved from that idea of allowing people to access content to making sure they understand how to mitigate risk and to look into ways of limiting disinformation using the tools of that nature.
Mm-hmm. So, Meera Selva, due to the fellowship program, you're in contact with lots of journalists all over the world, also with those maybe reporting from exile, but definitely with those who live in countries with very difficult working circumstances. What kind of new tools and forms of reporting can you identify, and are there some of them that you even teach at your program?
Well, I think podcasting is one area where you see a lot of journalists, both in exile and in countries where it's hard to report from, using this tool, partly because it's very low barrier to entry. It's fairly easy to distribute. It's easy to record. You can get a multiplicity of voices very, very quickly. And it's a very intimate connection. You feel like you're speaking to people. And I think for certain communities, this connection and this reminder of home and the reminder of your old communities is really important. So I think we're seeing a lot of podcasts coming out of this space. The other thing we're seeing is quite interesting uses of social media platforms such as Instagram, TikTok to some extent, but places where people can make short visual videos which can be shared easily online and can help build a community around a news event and be quite global in their reach as well.
Mm-hmm. Social media also always have a positive side and a negative side. As you said, you can start reporting like immediately using Instagram or YouTube. But in what way do you suggest your students using them, or does it also leave room for being attacked?
Well, yes, you absolutely leave room for being attacked. But I think, to be honest, what we're seeing is that journalism is under attack everywhere in every format. So whether you're a print news reporter or an online writer, or you work for a big television company, you're still vulnerable to attack in many ways in lots of countries, including ones that that journalism wasn't, never used to be considered an unsafe profession, and it's now. I think one thing to remember on social media is how things can be taken out of context. So people will read a headline and not necessarily read the article. A short piece can be edited down to be very misleading or misrepresentative. So it's very important that you package your content in a way that it's very clear the message you're trying to send and that it can't be distributed. And the other thing, crucially, is if you're a consumer of news, is to understand what you're seeing, where you're seeing it, who's putting it out to you, and to have some kind of a toolkit to kind of verify news, as my fellow panelists just said, to understand what you're seeing and to be able to verify the information. Because in cyberspace, it's very easy to become weaponized, both if you're a journalist and you're being fed the misleading information from one side or another, but also just simply as a reader or a consumer, by sharing, by liking, by essentially endorsing pieces of content without knowing really where it comes from. You could end up being dragged into a conflict or into a kind of propaganda war without realizing it.
Mm-hmm. And Walid, in what way are exile journalists exposed as a target for attacks when they're maybe active or visible on social media?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that really is harmful is the propagation of disinformation that targets a person and integrity of a person. Or nowadays, there's a proliferation of fake articles and, in fact, algorithms. And you've come to the point where there are deep fakes of videos themselves. So these are somewhat of a major risk to journalists. And so trying to build a reputation that can be demolished overnight is extremely devastating. And so that's one area that I'd like to focus on. And of course, there are cases where journalists themselves are mainly to blame because they don't take enough precaution. They don't follow the proper procedure of protecting their data and personal information. And a leak of any sort can be used against them, and that doesn't necessarily take over right away, but it can be saved and stored until a particular moment, which is disseminated to attack journalists. So that's one thing that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Meera just mentioned the importance of podcasts, and I'm coming back on this issue to you, Abdulwahab, just in a second, because you were just nodding to the answer of Walid all the time. Do you have experiences of being attacked via Twitter? I found you that you have an account there, or what can you tell? Do you have experiences in that field?
Well, I haven't been attacked personally on Twitter because of my views, but because of things, that I've tweeted before. And I got into, conflict with some people who are sharing lots of different stuff. So when I see people shifting stances, for example, and taking a pro-regime an anti-imperialist approach when it comes, for example, to Palestine, and then they side with the Syrian regime, because they think that this is anti-imperialism and the regime is an anti-imperialist, then I have problem with these people. And then when I point it out, then the supporter of these people have a huge platforms and, thousands and thousands of followers. Then, the attack starts. And this is kind of, is like having an icon, and this icon can never be touched regardless. So once one of those journalists or people with a huge followers establish themselves, regardless how they establish themselves, their views become kind of holy that you cannot really criticize at all. And we have a lot of these people in the British press, unfortunately. And most of them are white, middle-aged journalists who have no idea about our culture. I think most of them didn't even know where Syria was on the map before 2011. But suddenly they're always experts jumping from one platform to another, commenting on Venezuela, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Jordan, Somalia, you name it, how to make the best dish in Africa or whatever. They're always expert and, going from one platform to another.
Mm-hmm. So you wanted to bring, I guess, more enlightenment, not only for the British people, but you installed a podcast, which you can find on platforms which are much more important to you than Twitter, for example, Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcast, and it's called Integrate That. Why did you start it this summer, and what can your listeners expect from it?
So living in England for the past 8 years, I was really frustrated with the way the media has focused on the refugee crisis in Europe, because most of the stories are of someone who's left their home, whether it's in the Middle East or Pakistan or Afghanistan or Syria, Yemen, and they went to Europe, and now they settle down somewhere in Europe, and they're trying to learn the language, go to school, or find a job. That's it. It's a very, very, very shallow. And the problem is this is going on and on and on and on and happening for a number of years with no context whatsoever, with no really talking to the people, to the refugees, and ask them, hey, what's missing in this coverage? Because most of those reports are made from local people, local British people or Europeans, without consulting any refugees. So I thought, hey, wait a second, I'm a refugee. I know what's missing in this coverage. Let me talk to fellow refugees about topics they think that are important and people should know about. So I thought I was not supported. I did not have any funding. And as Meera said, podcast is the cheapest way and, available. It's free. All you need is a cheap mic. I got the cheapest mic on Amazon. That's like £30. And I contacted some refugees who were happy to talk to me on topics of their choice. I said, hey, what do you think is missing from the media coverage? And I say, the first one said, mental health problems. The second one said, finding a job. The third one said visas and traveling. And just talk to the people on a personal level, from one refugee to another. And it was very, very intimate talk. And we felt like, even though we didn't know each other before so much, but we could open up and tell very intimate stories that a lot of people told me when they listened to them, like, how can you share these stories online with people that easy? And it's like, well, you talk to people, they've been through a lot. You give them a platform to talk and own the narrative of their story. And this is the most important thing, that they own the narrative of their story. And however they want to tell their story, however they find it fit, not according to how any media platform would put it. And I believe that a lot of big media platform would not run such a podcast because it's not, it doesn't go well with their policy, or it doesn't go well with the way they want to view these stories or, report on these stories.
So I think your goal really worked out. I think it's great storytelling. I was listening to every episode of it, and actually now it got rewarded. You just won the European Internet Lobby Award. Congratulations to that.
Thank you.
You just said that you just bought a microphone for £30, and it's like very low-key access to do a podcast. Can you get a little bit more into it? Because it's, I think, a very, very good thing that it's so easy accessible, and you can immediately start bringing content or reaching a public. Can you tell us more about about the process, how you did it, also in a technological way?
Well, the process started with getting the mics, and I got the mics. I didn't have a recorder, so I was recording on my phone. I plugged in the mics into my phone. I tried to find a quiet place in the library. Most of the time, I find a public library, and we go there, find a corner, sit down, and record. And that's it, very simple. Now, the most important thing was here for me is that being ethical and knowing my interviewees very well before recording. So the first time I would meet them for coffee, and we would have coffee or tea or whatever, and we would just talk without any microphone, any camera, nothing. No, I wouldn't even take notes, just to make them feel like we're talking like human beings, like two friends talking to each other, telling their stories. So that I felt made people more relaxed, and I kept my connection with these people. I didn't lose it until now. We text, we talk to each other, and I think this is something missing from a lot of news organizations, that they don't have this connection one-to-one with the people. They don't follow up on their interviewees. People are seen as interviewees, not as collaborator. While I saw the other refugees as collaborator, I showed them the script of the episode when it finished before we aired it, if they are okay with it, and they asked me to change a few things, and I did. I consulted them with their choice of music. I consulted them with a lot of different things. So that's on the ethical side. I thought that was really missing in a lot of podcasts and a lot of video reports on media. On the technological side, it was, as I said, it's very simple. I did not have I didn't have any funding. I didn't have anything but my phone and my microphone. I started recording, then I put it on the computer. There are a lot of free software to use. I use one of them. I got an editor who is a volunteer who wanted to to help me with that. And then you put it on online on a free platform, Acast, which provides it to all the big platforms for free, but it doesn't give you any analysis. So I don't know exactly how many people. I don't know, have a rough idea, but I don't know exactly how many people. I don't have, for example, a website to build around it. I don't have a lot of resources are missing because it's just really two people's podcasts. It was me and my editor, but working very hard on it, being very ethical and really different to a lot of different podcasts. I thought that was really great. And we got an award for it, even though it was not funded. It was just two people. I was extremely happy with the outcome, and we're planning on to make season 2, hopefully in a couple weeks coming.
So maybe your story gives some inspiration to the people, to some of the listeners and viewers who are with us right now. Meera, can you think of specific examples of podcasts of people, of journalists who work in exile? Because you just said it's a very popular tool among them. Can you name some?
Kemal Gotkas, a Turkish journalist who was a fellow with me, who was a journalist for Cumhuriyet newspaper, produced podcast. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name because it's in Turkish, but it's something he produced while he was in exile in London. And it was very important for him. Very important for him to do this because his editor, various colleagues had been jailed in Turkey. He was really unsure about not being there. He was on the fellowship and he felt like he was abandoning his colleagues. And then when his fellowship ended, he had an ability to stay in England and he really didn't know what to do. He just didn't know whether you stay or you go or you risk jail. And in the end, producing this podcast enabled him to create a kind of new news product in a very, very polarized environment, because the issue in Turkey is that the media is so divided that if you work for the pro-government media, you really don't speak to anybody who works for a kind of independent opposition media. And his podcast really tried to create a space for kind of Turkish citizens who wanted to speak to each other about things as well, and to kind of overcome the polarization. So I think that was one very, very key podcast that I heard of.
But first you need great content, but in order to have an impact, you need a reach. And Abdulwahab, you told me that there's quite a problem in the Arab world because podcasts are not very popular there, so you don't have listeners there. Can you tell me why is that? How come?
Well,
and the same situation, by the way, in Hong Kong.
I'm not really sure why podcast is not very popular in Arabic in our countries, in Syria or in Arabic countries. I just know this is not really popular, even for the young people. Most of them go to Instagram or YouTube or TikTok nowadays, but podcast is not very popular. Now, some media companies are trying to push for a podcast, like Al Jazeera is trying to develop. They have a couple of podcasts, but they have a lot of episodes of these podcasts on YouTube, so people listen to them on YouTube, not really on your phone while you're commuting. So there's still a little bit of a difference. Maybe this is also because of the data. A lot of countries, data is very expensive in a lot of Arabic countries, like Emirates. My friends wanted to listen to my podcast, asked me to send him as the podcast as a audio message on WhatsApp, and he would download it at home and listen to it in his car. So it was very weird. It was very different. I thought this is not how you listen to podcasts. In Hong Kong here, I'm teaching students, and all my students are young undergraduate students. And when I talk about podcasts, only few students listen to podcasts. Not even one of them is studying journalism, doesn't even listen to podcasts. And again, I was really surprised that they don't listen to podcasts with all the movements that's happening here in Hong Kong. And, they talk about politics all the time. And whenever I ask students, okay, do you listen to podcasts? Anything political? No. We're on Instagram. We get our stories from Instagram. We get our news from Instagram. It's not even Twitter. And I was really surprised that Instagram is the go-to application for all those students that I've interacted with in Hong Kong. And that got me thinking, wait a second, if you wanna go to the market in Hong Kong, maybe I should start developing a Instagram channel instead of a podcast if I want to talk to the people and make an impact here.
Talking about social media and Instagram, now we're we're diving deep into the real techie stuff. Walid, you're currently doing research on applying another trend on journalism, namely the blockchain technology. And can you tell us more about it, how it can be useful for independent media and for maybe also exile journalists?
Thank you for the question. Basically, my interest in blockchain, first of all, as a note of caution, it is not only Bitcoin, while Bitcoin is one of the important aspects of it and how it started. But the idea behind blockchain came to me as a form of how to hold sources accountable, meaning that how to ensure that the data has not been modified or manipulated. Because one of the fundamental features of blockchains, when I define blockchains here, I mean permissionless blockchains that are available and accessible to anyone. And this constitutes the feature of immutability, meaning that if you have something recorded on a blockchain, it's like a publicly distributed ledger that anyone can look at. So once you have this carved there, then this information is there forever. It's permanently carved on the database because it's distributed across the world, and it's one copy that is part of the brick in the wall of ongoing, chains of data. So that meant that, for example, you can use this to ensure that official information, for example, official data coming from authorities, is there on the record and it's not manipulated later on. This means that, for example, if you have a video of a statement of an individual, for example, a president, that video is, if stored on the blockchain, it would be intact in its originality. And this led to a number of projects, including the News Provenance project that's taken a life of its own, led mainly by the New York Times, looking into ways in limiting the potential of manipulation of data once it's out. The challenge of deepfakes was one of those that brought a lot of concern. So if you can have the original content of data stored in such a way that cannot be manipulated over time, then that could serve the trustworthiness of sources. So if journalists rely on information that's taken from sources that have proven that their data is original, that would lead to building on their trust and confronting the rampant wave of disinformation. There is a project called TruePic. It's basically a software that uses your metadata around you. For example, the location, the temperature, location, the time, the original, camera that was used to take a picture. And this is stored and incorporated into the picture itself as metadata and then stored on a public blockchain. So this leads to the ability to keep that as in perpetuity, the evidence that could be used in the future in case something is required. And there was a use case of it for the war crimes in Syria, for example. If you can document the data there, and if you can allow the pictures and the videos to be stored on a blockchain, this can be used in a court of law, and it can be evidence for future generations that cannot be erased. So these are some of the ideas that I was interested in because of the amount and pace of disinformation and the lack of an ability to know what is true and what is not. That led me to do research on this and to consider the potential.
Well, this actually sounds like the perfect solution for all journalists who are doing investigative work, but also for those who have the guts to attack their regimes in their home country and to bring evidence and to have hard proof. It sounds like the perfect solution. When will it come to the masses, more or less? When can you use it on a daily basis?
Yeah, there's always an analogy that's drawn here. Blockchain today is similar to the internet at the early 90s or maybe late 80s. And it's extremely early in terms of scalability. We have problems with the blockchain technology. In terms of usability, user-friendliness. So the market cap of the whole blockchain environment in the cryptocurrency world is minuscule compared to other currencies. For example, And so it is at the very beginning of a journey, and it will have a lot of the challenges and obstacles ahead, including regulatory obstacles, technological obstacles. But I believe one by one, each of these would have either to be removed or to adapt. I mean, the technology itself will have to adapt and evolve to make it possible for use by the masses. But I believe strongly in its applicability, because we do not have such a thing yet. It is available for the cases of when you have, for example, the accounting mechanisms. When you have accounting, you have a record that is permanent, because you can't simply say this accounting didn't take place, but you can reverse the accounting. We do have that for data, for some sorts of financial services, but we don't have that for original data coming from official sources, for example, or evidence. And so these sorts of applications are being explored by many, including our own department at Södertörn University. And I think that you can call me in 10 years and perhaps it will be a totally different picture.
Well, hopefully earlier than 10 years. Meera, how does it sound to you? Does it sound too good to be true? Because then you would have a solution for fighting fake news, protect both journalists and sources, and have it all shared on an international network. How does it appear to you?
It sounds wonderful, but like you said, so did the internet when you started it. The idea of kind of open, free flow information, equal platforms for all voices, a kind of free and open exchange. It sounds utopian. What we do always find is that people manipulate and dominate and lie and seize control of the assets and seize controls of the means of distribution. So I think blockchain has absolutely got tremendous potential, but we've got to be as wary or careful not to repeat the same mistakes that were made when we embraced the platforms, when we embraced Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as the new ways to reach out to people. We need to make sure that we don't fall into similar traps with blockchain. I can't tell you what the traps are, because I think this is one of the new things about technology, is that we don't know exactly what will get in the way, but we do know human nature, and human nature hasn't changed. So I think we need to be very cautious. That said, I do think blockchain offers specific solutions that journalism needs. Part of it is this metadata and a kind of timestamp on images that's absolutely needed. And it also, its cryptocurrency element does provide a possible solution for how do we pay for journalism. It's a very easy way to pay for small amounts of journalism, and so that several people can make small micropayments. And also it's a way of not just saying here's some money, but here's a stamp of faith. Here's a kind of stamp to say that I believe in your journalism. And we've seen projects like Civil, run by Vivian Schiller and Maria Ressa, look at this. They tried to create a form of blockchain technology that creates a kind of ecosystem of trusted journalism. So I think there are definite problems that can be solved through blockchain, but I would just be very wary, and I don't think anyone on this panel has suggested that we should, but I'd be very wary of embracing it uncritically and wholeheartedly, given our past experience and everything that's happened with the internet.
Exactly. So a rollout of the blockchain technology is still like a future dreams and may have its advantages and disadvantages, but maybe it would have helped you at your former work, Abdulwahab, because once you worked for a journalistic project where you did research on airstrikes in Syria in order to get transparency about eventual civilian casualties. What research methods did you use by then in order to get your information?
So as Walid said at the beginning of his talk, that there were a lot of people asking for information when the Arab Spring started. In Syria, everyone had a cell phone, and everyone was able to record what was going on and put it on Facebook. And what was being put on Facebook and Twitter was for local to consume it and to be aware of what was going on and what was happening. If there was an airstrike in Aleppo, you would know exactly where the airstrike was, and you would see people and pictures of people there taking pictures of the outcome, of people who died, who got injured, and everything, right? And this was all for local people to consume. Nobody thought any Western journalist would pick it up. So me being in London and speaking the language, knowing the culture, know where to find this information, I was able to follow every airstrike. So whenever there was a report of an airstrike, I would check where it was. So for example, it was against ISIS in Raqqa. That was the hotspot. So I would check and look at the people who live there, what they say, and look at the media centers there and look what they say, and comparing against each other and document it. So a lot of times you would see videos, you would see pictures, you would see geographical places, and we would take it and then send it to the military. Say, hey, you bombed here. There's an allegation of bombing here. Did you do that? And the coalition, U.S.-led coalition, would say, it's either we will investigate it or no, it was not us. If they say, well, we will investigate it, and then they will come back to us and tell us exactly yes or no, because there are a lot of variation, but this is in short. Now, all of this work was done by the local people. All this information is done by the local heroes, who risk their life, especially if you're living in an ISIS-controlled area. You risk your life putting information out there. Unfortunately, a lot of media organizations in the West take the credit for themselves, and they don't even credit the locals. They don't credit the local researchers. That happened to me in one of the places that I left, that all the folks that were credited were the white folks, none of the locals. And that was really deeply ethically hurt. And this is one of the things that journalists really need to learn. When I was in London, I was teaching at UAL, University of the Arts London. I was teaching undergraduates ethics of war reporting. I was teaching them things that they didn't really know before, but the ethics, crediting people, open source investigation, how the local people usually pay the price, but the Western journalists usually get the award, unfortunately. And they don't get the money, they don't get anything, they just put the information out there. And this is really troubling. And I think there are now some calls for this to change or to credit people. But again, changes in media takes a lot of time, because most of the people who run these organizations, even though they have very good intentions to help the locals, but they still have very old-fashioned kind of way of procedures to follow.
So you're addressing another problem here, appreciation also of your sources. But maybe you might have the best tools, the best sources, the best journalistic content. And Meera, in one of your YouTube sessions, you said what journalists actually also need, being in exile or working in difficult countries, difficult for the media, they need, well, appreciation, solidarity, and a network. And why is it so important for you to emphasize that?
Solidarity and a network. I did a survey of journalists in Central and East Europe who are working in very difficult conditions with governments which are openly critical of journalists. So they work in an environment where they're constantly being called liars and traitors by their prime ministers, by their ministers, and they're mistrusted by the public. So we say to them, what would help? What would help you? And they all essentially said solidarity from other colleagues in your country. So they don't want us. They don't want kind of big international organizations to say, well done, you're doing a great job. They want their colleagues or they want their rivals to say, we recognize that you're doing a good job under difficult circumstances. That's all they wanted. So I think this is something, I was looking for things that can be usefully done in these conditions. The other thing about this point about recognition for local journalists. It's very important because we're having a conversation now in all countries about diversity in the media and whose voices we center. And this often bumps up against the kind of quite Western notion of impartiality. So a foreign correspondent can only be impartial if he or she is not from the region at all, has no stake in the conflict, has no stake in the place they're reporting from, if they're basically parachuted in as an outsider. And that's where you get these kind of situations arising. So someone comes in from abroad, speaks to the locals, and then says, I present my authoritative voice. Now, what we're realizing is two things. Firstly, that authoritative voice is no less biased or impartial or weighted with its own prejudices and assumptions as anybody else's. And secondly, it's morally wrong, and it's also downright insulting to people on the ground to say you can't be impartial. If you're a local journalist, you can't report on your own country impartially, because we don't say that to journalists in Germany or the United Kingdom, that because you're German or British, you're not allowed to report on your own country. We assume that you have a professional level of training and impartiality, and we need to accord that same respect to journalists in war zones, in conflict zones, in countries with difficult conditions.
So respect is one other great important thing. Thank you for addressing this. Walid, coming back to the situation of exiled journalists, in order to give them support and help, what do you suggest them? Where can they get that help? Maybe at NGOs or certain programs? What can you add to this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm not as deeply involved with international networks of journalists as Meera and possibly Abdulwahab, but I am involved in academic networks. And one interesting area that we've been exploring is to bring in journalists to give speeches to inform the public on a wider scale, on academic perhaps. It's not necessarily a mainstream event, but it's a place where the scientists can help drive some new ideas and look into the data from their sources. An example is a speech recently given by Ali Al-Ibrahim. I'm not sure if you know him, but he is the person who produced I believe, A Day in Aleppo. It's a documentary film. He's a documentary filmmaker showing the destruction of war and the casualties that took place during the war. And he elates this to the public through seminars. He is also an award winner. And so whenever you are, if you are in a situation where you can present these voices, make sure that you put an effort to let them be heard. And another aspect is to help link them up, as Meera mentioned, network with those that are in the same country. Or sometimes in the region. For example, there is this investigative network called Arij in the Middle East, and they are working hard to enhance the capacity and competence of journalists, because being in a network is not an end in its own. And it has to be done, seen as a means to produce something better. And one thing that I keep on emphasizing, maybe I'm using my academic or educational hat too much, is empower them with skills, with abilities. And in fact, Abdulwahab mentioned earlier the fact that open source investigations is something that they can tap into, especially exile journalists, because it uses a lot of the tools that exist online. You don't need to be physically in a location to help find the facts or verify information that you have online. So these tools can be, let's say, taken advantage of. And we can empower them with that. We can empower them with courses, with seminars, with opportunities, and so that they build their profiles, they build their reputation, and then use this information and training to help others in the field, maybe online as well as offline.
Well, thank you for giving these recommendations. To sum it all up, Abdulwahab, since you are directly now in the situation of being an exiled journalist, although you work in another field now, but what would you recommend to all to the listeners who are with us right now? What would be the best to do in exile on a technological basis and also on a networking basis to keep going also in their job?
As Meera and Walid said, as Meera said about diversity is an incredibly important thing that is deeply, really needed in a lot of places, especially in media, because you'd see a lot of reports, a lot of things that are completely different. Most likely, journalists, Western journalists don't speak the language of the locals. So diversity is very important. And as Walid said, that if you're an organization that you can hire local people to report about their country, please do that. If you're in a place where you're an award body and you need some judges, bring them on. If you're a media organization, start hiring those people from these countries who can do the job, and not only hire them to do the jobs to report on their country, but hire them to work, to do their own job. For example, I'm also a guest on another podcast called The Week Unwrapped in England, where I can speak about any issue that I feel like, based on my journalistic views, right? Because I'm a journalist after all. So not only reporting on things about refugees in Syria, but be a journalist and put my journalistic knowledge to use. So if you're an artist, and you can hire some people to be an artist, don't just hire them for an art job about refugees. Hire them to be artists. They're good artists. If they're doctors, hire them because they're good doctors. Not you see, beyond who they are as refugees. And if you are a refugee or in your exile or just in exile, don't really count on big organization, unfortunately, because it's really difficult to penetrate. Start doing whatever you can do on your own. I wish someone had told me this when I first arrived in England. After more than 100 job applications that got all returned to me, I started reading the second paragraph, unfortunately. So I started doing my own podcast, started on my own networking, and it goes from there. Put on the work, and hopefully you'll get rewarded for it.
Well, thank you all so much for these very interesting and useful insights and recommendations. Well, now it's time, I think, to open up the discussion for all the viewers who are on the other side of the screen. And we're curious about the questions that you might have to our wonderful guests. You can write them down via menti.com, and Johanna from the Körber-Stiftung will hand them in.
Thank you. So I would like to start with a question to Meera. The question is, what kind of trends in the media system in general are relevant for exiled journalists?
I think two things, membership drives, subscriptions, so how you pay for journalism, and secondly, how people find journalism, because this is a key point, discoverability and shareability. You could be producing amazing work, but if no one finds you, then what do you do with this? So I think the key things we're finding is that more and more people come to news via social media. So in a way, this is good for people starting their own podcasts, their own websites. You don't need a big homepage and a newspaper and a landing page or a landing site for people to come to. You need to be on Twitter, on Instagram, on the networks, and people will find you through that. So that's one trend we're really seeing. The other thing we're seeing, because all this journalism is incredibly important, but it needs to be paid for. It needs to be financially sustainable, partly to pay the salaries of the journalists, but also to be independent and credible. People need to know where the money is coming from. And I think when we look at this, what we're seeing is a trend towards subscriptions where people are willing to pay for journalism, not necessarily to have it exclusively for themselves, but to keep it going. So this is a model you see with things like The Guardian, but also certainly several smaller sites where people pay a subscription, but not to erect a paywall. So the subscription is not a paywall, it is a contribution, which is also a way of saying, thank you for your journalism, I value it, and I want it to continue, and I want it to be spread amongst other people as well.
Johanna, do you have another question?
Yes, I have another question. This question is for Walid. Exile journalists are familiar with threats to their work and safety in general. In addition to that, the digitalization harbors new risks. How can the journalists gather and save information and maintain contact to sources while being exposed to cyber attacks? And is it maybe necessary to think outside of the box?
Well, I mean, I'd say that in today's digital world, the most experienced of people will still have to learn. I mean, there's never an end to the capacity to inform yourself and acknowledge things. Recently, we've seen that there are leaks in major corporations across the cloud. And so there is no, let's say, situation where you would say, I am satisfied with what I know. So learning, educating yourself, expanding your knowledge, being aware of the increasing risks, and following the strict protocol of how to publish online, how to save your data online. I cannot tell you how many times that journalists are being caught in situations where their data gets leaked or their accounts get hacked. And so this is something that you build over many years, and suddenly, out of the blue, everything is demolished. And so it's prudent that they invest a little bit more time to enhance their understanding of what are the digital skills that they need to acquire to protect their security, and to be aware of the potential risks they cause to their sources. And that's why it's often the case that sources are victims. And in cases of communicating with a very high-profile journalist, that channel of communication might be eavesdropped, that can be surveilled. And so it's ethically and obviously in terms of accountability important for journalists to inform their sources about this potential risk. And yes, we are in an age of internet, everyone's communicating, but yes, so do many governments and many in entities that would like to confront activists and like to find out more information and spy on others. So it's open for everyone. And often these sources, let's say, are not as equipped as the journalists or the authorities that are being monitoring them. So these things, lead you to see that the encryption techniques, for example, learning how to safeguard your sources, using means of anonymizing the quotations, all of sorts. This is crucially important, especially for sources in conflict zones.
To learn from your enemies. What else can you add to this? None? Okay, well, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending the session. And please stay safe in these times. Thank you very much for attending to you as well.